So our third and last speaker is Dr. Silvia Camporesi. She's a bioethicist with an interdisciplinary background in biotechnology, ethics, and philosophy of medicine. And she's based at King's College in London, UK. And she's a director of the master's program Bioethics and Society. And she began actually her career as a molecular biologist. And over the past decade, she has written extensively about the ethics of emerging biotechnologies, including 2 books on gene doping in sports. So welcome, Dr. Camporesi.
Thank you so much, Thomas, and the organizer, for inviting me. It's really a pleasure to be here with Liz and Paula, and it's like going back to full circle because I started my career in a gene therapy lab, so it's great to see familiar faces here, Mauro Zacca, Lorena Zentilin. Anyhow, bioethics of genome editing, that's a huge topic. So I think the most interesting thing for today is actually going to be if we can have a little bit of discussion. So what I want to focus on is, I will not talk about the promises and fears of genome editing as you can see in this slide. So I will not talk about designer babies or eugenics, because I think that's counterproductive for bioethicists, and of course this would be the worst audience. In fact, I think that one of the problems with bioethics or with a certain type of doing bioethics is that, first of all, it's highly polarized. So you have bioconservatives on one hand and bioliberal on the other hand, pro-enhancement, etc. And often it is hyped. This might not be a problem, of course, only of bioethics. Indeed, bioethicists may reinforce some of the hypes that we see elsewhere in the media, but also in the science, and this is part of the system. But a certain way of doing bioethics in this way is definitely, I think, counterproductive. Also, by novelty seeking, I mean that bioethics always asks the question, what is new with CRISPR genome editing technologies or other genome editing technology? This is something that we were discussing last night with Liz and Thomas, and I think bioethicists in a way see this novelty seeking as a way of legitimizing that we are useful, but I don't think that's necessarily a good way, and actually could have a backlash when we see that historically, culturally and socially informed approach can actually show that some of the ethical issues related to genome editing had been discussed before, and some of the solutions that have been put forward before can be useful today. And of course, we don't want to have a bioethics which is detached from the real world and can also end up alienating the public. So 3 basic, let's say, rules for bioethics should be, I think, to avoid promises and fear rhetoric, to have a bottom-up approach grounded in case studies, grounded in a real feasible scientific scenario, and be historically and culturally informed. And something that I often do with my students as King's. One of the great things of being at King's is to have a variety of students from all over the world, is actually ask them about bioethical controversies, how they arise, are shaped, and are solved in different countries. Because the political, social, and historical setting in which a controversy arises matters for how the controversy is shaped, for the kind of ethical question that we ask, and for the kind of solution that we put forward. Okay, so of course when we talk about genome editing and the many different applications, what I'm going to focus on is application to human reproduction. And I'm just going to focus on 2 of the feasible scenarios. The first one would be using genome editing coupled with preimplantation genetic diagnosis for the prevention of monogenic genetic disorders in prospective parents who are both homozygous for a recessive disorder, or in the case of autosomal disorders for which a parent is homozygous. Another of the application which has been put forward as a feasible scenarios by is maybe a bit more difficult to attain in practice is use genome editing, again coupled with preimplantation genetic diagnosis, to enhance the success rate of assisted reproductive technology. And actually one of the goals of the lab based at the Francis Crick Institute in London, which was, if you may recall, the first lab having a license to use genome editing on human embryos, led by Katie Niakan, is to look at the causes of infertility, and one of the goals is really not to enhance the success rate, or at least one of the aims, the clinical application. So if we look at the long-standing concern with germline genome editing, here I have a list of arguments that I think might be familiar to many of you. The first one is, of course, that we just shouldn't do it because by editing the germline and editing a future generation, we are playing God. So this is the argument of hubris, as it is known as. Second argument is related, is tampering or modifying human nature. Of course, this argument presupposes that there is an essentialist thinking, that human nature has an essential core that we shouldn't change. Once we do that, we lose part of what it means to be a human being. So this question about genome editing really speaks to the core of what it is to be human. Third question is, of course, crossing species boundaries. When we talk about genome editing applied, for example, for humanized animal models to create, for example, for organ transplant. This is something that I'm not going to talk about in the presentation, but perhaps we can discuss. And crossing species boundaries often elicit the fear of hybrid or chimeras, mythological characters, and it's actually not a new argument, which we've seen before when we were talking about cytoplasmic hybrid embryos, about in 2006, 2007. So, yeah, here we go. Interfering with future people autonomy. Of course, this is the main point. Of course, this should be quite obvious. If you're talking about somatic gene therapy, we have an individual to whom we can ask for consent. When we're editing the germline, we are talking about editing future people, so we cannot ask for their consent. And also another of the ethical issues and concerns about germline genome editing is a question of access and the question of possibly exacerbating existing social inequalities between people who have access to the technology and people who don't. And actually this is also an argument that has been put forward in a book that's now almost 20 years old. It's called From Chance to Choice by Helen Buchanan, quite well-known political philosopher based here in the US, and other 3 scholars. And finally, these are not in order of importance, but the unforeseen consequences on human evolution in the long term. We are editing out a gene because we think it's related to a disorder, but what if it was advantage in another context, and what are we doing to the future of our species? So if some of these concerns sound familiar, it's because they are. In fact, I just took them from the Splicing Life report that dates back to 1982. When I do this, again, with my students, none of them were born in 1982, so it seems far, but it wasn't really that far back. And as I was refreshing my memory, reading the report over the past couple of days. Is actually very interesting to see how these arguments were discussed in the light of recombinant DNA and how they can be applied today to ethics of genome editing. So talking about ethics of genome editing, the standard way, so to say, to look at the ethical issues raised by genome editing, and before that gene therapy, if we can consider that as an umbrella term, is to use the somatic germline distinction. This distinction has played a very important ethical and political role since 1992, the Splicing Life report, as a demarcating line. So it's been used to demarcate ethically permissible, morally justifiable from impermissible application of gene therapy and now genome editing. And indeed, the distinction is enshrined in many international guidelines all over the world. And within bioethics, well, even though I'm sure some of my fellow bioethicists will not agree because we always like to be controversial, but I think it's fair to say that there is a de facto agreement that different ethical considerations apply to the somatic application of gene therapy and genome editing and to the germline application. And this is something I was just talking about when I was mentioning interfering with future people autonomy. Of course, if we talk about somatic gene therapy, again, we have the individual. We can ask for informed consent, and the individual, unless there are issues of competence or capacity, will be able to have an assessment of the risk-benefit ratio. And these are actually ethical issues inherent in participation in clinical trial, in clinical research, so standard ethics of clinical research. While when we talk about germline application, we don't have that individual, and since we are, in this sense, interfering with future people autonomy because we are making decisions for them, again, the agreement is that the benefits of the technology really need to outweigh the risk or the harms that can be derived from interfering with future people autonomy. So that's why this is the approach of the recent 2017 National Academy of Science and National Academy of Medicine report on genome editing. We should only consider germline application of genome editing in the case of severely disabling conditions. And while this approach has been as I was saying, has been the standard approach for now over 35 years to demarcate ethically permissible from ethically impermissible application of the technology. I would like to point out today that I think has some limits or some shortcomings. Because here, let me explain. If we frame the issue of the ethics of genome editing or the ethics of a novel technology only in terms of somatic germline distinction of risk-benefit assessment, the questions that we're going to ask are going to be how type of question. So how can we apply genome editing in the context of X, Y, Z? And while these are very valid ethical questions, and indeed you may recall these are ethical and social and legal implication of the personal genome project and so on and so forth, asks this kind of question, such an approach leaves out or risks crowding out other type of very important ethical questions that discuss the role of the certain technology, in this case genome editing, in society. So for example, instead of asking what role does genome editing applied in the context of reproduction to prevent monogenic disorder play, what societal needs does genome editing answer applied in the context of reproduction, we only ask how can it be ethically applied. And of course, these are very difficult kind of questions to answer, but I think we need to have this kind of discussion. And once we do that, once we start asking a broader kind of question about the role that genome editing plays in society and the kind of needs that it answer, then a new space for bioethics or for discussion in general opens up. And I just want to give you an example of how this can happen in practice. So going back to germline genome editing applied in the context of reproduction. So instead of asking how can it be ethically applied, somatic germline distinction, risk-benefit assessment, informed consent, autonomy, we can ask, okay, what is the role that genome editing applied in the context of reproduction play? And obviously, if you think about it, it answers the need of individuals who wish to have genetically related children, but as I had it in my previous slide, they cannot do that because they are both homozygous for recessive disorders, or one of the two is homozygous for an autosomal dominant disorder. So they cannot go through standard pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. They need to have a genome editing. But when we start asking or framing the ethics of genome editing this kind of way, then we start thinking about alternatives to genome editing, which not only are biological alternatives. So in this case, we could think about donor gametes for IVF for assisted reproduction, but we could also start thinking about the social alternative. For example, adoption. And this is again something we were discussing last night. And the ethics, then we start asking ourselves different kind of questions. This doesn't mean we shouldn't be asking the how type of question, just mean we should also be discussing this type of question. For example, to what extent should we, in a society in which, of course, we have limited resources, we are all competed for limited resources, should we satisfy or try to grant prospective parents' wish to have a genetically related child? Why is the case that in our society we still place a very high, we still consider something called genetic essentialism in reproduction or procreation? Shouldn't we instead start to think about parenting and reproduction in terms of beyond the genetic ties between parent and children? So some of the questions that we might ask are also ethics and politics of adoption. And indeed, some scholars have started to do that. For example, at Johns Hopkins University, you have Travis Reader who started to do that. But also we start thinking about policy because, you know, I don't know much about the policies of adoption in this country, but of course in the country where I work, in the UK, where I come from, Italy, it's not that easy to adopt a child. So if we had easier policy to incentivize adoption, then perhaps prospective parents would consider that. And another example, which I don't have in this slide, but perhaps it's worth discussing, is application of genome editing to create humanized animal models for organ transplant. Again, if we only ask the question, how should we ethically apply genome editing to create humanized animal organs? For organ transplant, we ask questions about the welfare of the animals in which we're growing the organs, the safety issues, and for transplant to human beings, and we discuss the fact that we do need human organs. You always hear how many people die every year waiting in line for an organ. Instead, if we start asking this kind of question about organ transplant, we should start thinking about there are countries in the world where the default is an opt-in for organ donation. In the UK, it's Wales, for example, and they have very high rates of organ donation. And then you have organs available for transplant. So this is why what I'm trying to hint at when I'm talking about the social alternatives to a technology, not only the biological alternatives. Again, this is not to say that we shouldn't consider the how type of question, but that we should also discuss when we talk about organ donation, if we are having a societal discussion, why we don't have incentives in place for human-to-human organ donation. So to moving towards the conclusion, I think that bioethics of genome editing need not be necessarily new. As I was showing you, the 1982 Splicing Life reports list the same ethical issues that you can read today in peer-reviewed articles in bioethics, nor should it be. I think what we don't need always to, as bioethicists, to seek the novelty in the latest technology to say, oh, that we are useful, and actually can be counterproductive because in society then, in a sense, we can alienate the public from some of this discussion when it's obvious that if we were promising panacea for a cure and great hopes for bioethics for a previous technology, then and that wasn't the case, then it can be counterproductive. Also, I think as I was saying, it needs to be an historically informed approach to the issue, because we may find enlightening to read to see how certain issues have been discussed in the past. I haven't really talked about the social and cultural context in which the controversies arise, but often the way certain ethical issues is discussed is heavily shaped by the historical and cultural milieu. Finally, the point I was trying to make at the end is that while it is important to ask how type of ethical question, it's also important to ask questions about what is the role that genome editing plays in this particular context, organ transplant, reproduction, what societal need does it answer, what are the alternatives, biological or social. I'd like to end on this quote by Alfred Norman: ethical concern is a scarce resource, must not be squandered on incredible future, especially when they distract from ongoing developments that demand our attention. So thank you, and I look forward to question or discussion.
Thank you. So please come forward and ask any questions to both Silvia but also the whole panel. Otherwise we'll kind of start discussing some of the questions I think Silvia touched on. Okay. So is the, yeah. Oh, perfect. Thank you. On the right.
Thank you for your talks, all of you. I'm going to raise a bioethical question. Let's see if I can frame it simply. The concern I saw on the slide about the inability of a preconceived individual to consent or a new conception to avoid genetic disease seems very dangerous to me from the perspective of a woman's reproductive autonomy. It seems to me that the principle under Roe v. Wade, which governs American law and says it is a woman who controls her body, is challenged by that articulation. Secondly, in American law at least, the notion of what is in the best interest of the child is firmly established from several different perspectives. So I wonder if you could answer that in the context of its impact on women's reproductive freedom.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm aware that that's actually a very good question. So there are possible conflicts raised by the ethical issue around we don't have the informed consent of the future generation when we talk about genome editing, but also the context of a reproductive decision. And this is not only an ethical issue raised by genome editing, but we see it, for example, conflicts with fetal protection law in this country, or also elsewhere, for example, in Australia, which pose a challenge to Roe versus Wade and to the autonomy of the woman. What I would like to say that in bioethics, but also I think in law, there's nothing that is really even ethical issue that we think have been discussed and we should be our starting point for future discussion. Actually, that's not the case, because we can see that Roe versus Wade, or even the right of a woman to have an abortion, is not something that is still controversial, and we see it on the basis of fetal protection law and the conflict that it poses. But in particular, I think the point here with consent is that we shouldn't, when we're talking about editing the genome of future generation, we should consider what are other alternatives. So it is really an option for a limited number of prospective individuals who are homozygous for a recessive disease, or as I was saying, they have one of them is dominant for a recessive disease. Otherwise, parents have the possibility to go through pre-implantation genetic diagnosis. So that's part of your answer, of the answer to your question. I don't recall the second second part of the question, but perhaps, yeah.
Can you step up a little bit? Sorry.
That parents make very
The best
important
interest, yeah.
parents make very important decisions
Yeah.
for their children's chemotherapy, whether to withdraw treatment in life-threatening situations. I think it's certainly an American law that I know,
Yeah.
and even at the
Yeah.
level of the Supreme Court, there's been many decisions
Yeah.
supporting that. I think it runs counter to the overall right of parents
Yeah.
to care for their children.
Yeah, no, thank you, and sorry for best interest of the child, yes, but in this case we do not have a child. So the best interest applies in the case in which we have a child in front of us and cannot make a decision on their own. And in the UK we have something similar, and then we have the Gillick competence guidelines for which we assess whether a child is competent even if it hasn't reached maturity from a legal point of view. But in the case of genome editing, we do not have that child in front of us. We're talking about future people, so best interest of principle does not apply.
So maybe the rest of the panel wants to weigh in.
In terms of best interests for adoption and consent, in that case, I don't really have a very good sense of policy and stuff for adoption, but in that case I don't think that the individual has much autonomy or ability to consent either, at least early in the process, until they're 18 or 21 or whatever.
No, that's correct, but in that case we do have, I mean this is more general point, we also we don't choose the families in which we are born, but the point about adoption is really, you know, when we are thinking about what societal need does genome editing answer, we should be thinking about the alternatives. Again, this is not to say that we shouldn't pursue genome editing in the context of reproduction, but if we want to have a broad societal discussion about the role and place of genome editing within our society, there is now an increasing number of scholars within bioethics, but also science and technology studies. And here in the UF, one prominent example is Sheila Jasonov of the Kennedy School of Law, talking about, you know, the socio-technical expectation of the technologies and also the possible biofutures that are linked to a certain technologies. And that's why we should try to think about genome editing in a broader way. Then new kinds of ethical questions arise. Of course, in adoption, for maybe some of the question would impact until what age can a child be adopted, and the kind of issues and relationship that arise between the child and the parent. Of course, one cannot be an expert in all of these questions. So within, as I'm sure you might realize, within bioethics there are people specializing in ethics of adoption, and I mentioned Travis Reeder at Baltimore, people specializing in ethics of genome editing applied to the germline, genome editing applied to organ transplants, so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think it's kind of interesting to think about the prospects of dire unmet need for children that need adoption, that don't have parents, that etc., versus genetic essentiality.
So maybe more about the relationship between scientists. We have two scientists, actually three, sorry, and one bioethicist here. So what do you think the relationship really should be between the people that do the science and the bioethicists? So to which degree should be scientific responsibility early on in the process play a role in what experiments you plan, what therapies you develop? Especially with respect to, like, for example, like what you mentioned, addressing infertility and so on.
I actually think it's interesting that both scientists who work on genome editing and bioethicists kind of feel like we're the ones who should be making the decisions. You know, every time I've been involved in a panel discussing this, there's a certain tension between the bioethicists and the genome editors, and I always kind of think, I wonder what my parents would think about this. I wonder what my neighbor would think about this. It seems to me that actually, you know, they're the people we should be asking, and maybe they don't care. I don't know. What does our audience think? Who should decide?
Go ahead. Yeah, you twitched over there. There's a microphone right there. Thank you. If you
Oh, yeah,
twitch, I'll call you
we
out.
can't see you. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, no, I think that's really interesting because we think of like the language of informed consent, right? And the level, like it's supposed to be 8th grade reading level or lower, and the comprehension and understanding of this type of a question. So if we look at like a bell curve of society and their overall knowledge of this space, how do we inform them appropriately in the first place to understand what this really means? Like we could sit here and have coffee and a philosophical debate about ethics, but breaking it down in a simple way that people can make a decision, I think, is the first challenge for us, right? So, but then oftentimes, and I think what a gentleman was asking is, there's the law, right, that are in different countries and around the world have different policies, and then there's the ethics. So there's two different things, right? Like something may be unethical, but it may be legal, right, or vice versa. But when it comes to life and death, parents are going to want to do what's best for their children. And I'd say there's also some sort of like pride in having my own child versus adoption. So there's some other sociological aspects of adoption that I think are really interesting. But it's a broader discussion than just a bioethicist and the genome editing scientist, I think.
So how do you propose we sort of address that in terms of like education, the scientific education? What I hear here is basically we have all these very fine distinctions, somatic versus germline and so on, but how do we communicate this outwards to the people that eventually vote on it? Or
Yeah. Well, I think more people are aware now than what they were in 1982 when that report came out. So, I heard in line earlier that this is more people at this conference than last year and any conference before. So I think the space is growing and awareness is growing, and it's becoming more normal at least in our society in the US and probably in a lot of other countries. So I think over time that will become less of an issue because it almost normalizes at a society level. But I think from a simplification of the information so that people can understand it is really critical throughout our entire, from basic scientists to, drug companies that are developing these therapies. So
maybe the panel has more ideas.
I was going to say, one of the issues, of course, is that even if we came to a consensus, people are individuals and they don't follow rules. I'm always struck by something that was said to me a few years ago when I first started working on this therapy, and people who are HIV positive would come up to me and we'd talk about it and when it would be available and what I thought the risks were and everything. And I felt kind of conflicted because I didn't know what the risks were, so I didn't know what to say to somebody who would say, should we enroll in this trial? And I'm kind of super conservative, so especially, back then I would be like, I don't know, I wouldn't want to be patient number 1. I might want to be patient number 1,000, And I got my head bitten off by somebody because something I hadn't thought about was an HIV-infected man said to me, I believe he was 58 when he said it. He said, I'm 58 years old and I've been HIV infected for at least 30 years, and I'm here today because in the 1980s, people who are HIV infected took a risk. They took a risk on toxic early drugs, on AZT, on things that were actually much less effective and much more toxic. And I'm here today because I'm part of a community that has a history of stepping up and being involved in clinical trials. And don't you dare talk to me about taking that opportunity away from us. So that kind of really struck me because I hadn't even thought about an altruistic component of being involved in clinical trials and subjecting yourself to things like this. So I guess that's also a factor that even if we decide what we as a society or a community think is sensible, what is risky, what isn't, people are going to make up their own minds, and why shouldn't they?
Yeah, I tend to agree with you, but I would like to point out that this is also culturally and socially shaped because we are talking about this here in this country. And I don't know if many of you, some of you might have heard the case of Charlie Gard case in the UK with a terminally ill child sick with a neurodegenerative disease. The parents wanted to take their child to the US for some Yeah, Sweeter, that's another child. So it's very similar case, but that's more recently. And in that case, they were working under the assumption of we decide what is in the best interest of our child, but according to the UK law, it's doctors choosing what's in the best interest of their children. It's not parents, so they were not allowed to do that. So again, that's why bioethics and law, we have to have this conversation. That's why it's so interesting when you have people coming from different backgrounds, and even here in the panel or in the audience today. Even the question about how much risk should people take. If you adopt a libertarian approach, they would say as much risk as you want. People can make an autonomous decision as long as they don't have issues of capacity or competence. And this is part of what bioethicists would say. And then there is another, on the other spectrum of bioethics, there is, no, you don't get to choose how much risk you're taking. We adopt a paternalistic approach or sort of soft paternalism, because now paternalism has been a bit out of fashion, in which we assess what is the level of risk that you are going to take. So even if you would like, we don't enroll you in clinical trials. So I think that many of the real ethical issues related to genome editing pertain to the somatic application, but then if we talk about that, we fall into ethics of clinical research, of early clinical trials. As Paula was saying, phase 1, there's nowhere said that they work, but what if a patient has exhausted as a treatment option and wants to be enrolled, as long as it meets the criteria for enrollment? So then we talk about ethics of translational trials, of first investigational studies, and so on.
And I think that they're really important points too. I mean, back to Paula's point, from the patient's perspective, there's also then, especially in phase 1 trials, the role of the physician and their choice as to whether to engage in a therapy that is novel, perhaps somewhat untested in a large population of patients, versus something that's tried and tested and definitely going to work. And again, it's like, from the patient perspective, you want to, if it weren't for those people that took risks to some degree, we wouldn't be where we are. And it's, I think, also the same for physicians to be trying to improve therapeutics over time by taking some considered risks. And I think that there are really important ways in which all of us engage, between bioethicists, scientists, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
So maybe one last point. You mentioned the NAM report on genome editing, and one thing I think that was mentioned in there also sort of to draw a line a little bit between therapy and enhancement, and this applies obviously both to somatic and also more to the germline therapy. How do you think we can draw that line, and how could this be regulated or enforced? This is obviously a technical question, but it's also more of a philosophical question.
This is a tough question. I mean, this talks about, I didn't talk about enhancement, but in bioethics works on binaries, so distinction, somatic germline, therapy, enhancement, and many other distinctions that are used to demarcate what is permissible as shortcuts, basically. But bioethicists disagree on what counts as enhancement, and even whether enhancement is good for you or not. So I'm sure even at the summit in DC, there were bioethicists from the UK, such as John Harris or Julian Savulescu, would say, there is a continuum between therapy and enhancement, and we should pursue whatever we can, including enhancement, always on the basis of people autonomy. Of course, one of the objections, and here I'm oversimplifying, is that it's going to lead to a slippery slope to eugenics. Then there are problems of equality of access. We're going to end up in a society in which individuals make choices on the basis of what is of trying to give their children the best possible chance in life. So there is a principle in bioethics called principle of procreative beneficence. All parents, to some extent or another, make some decision on the basis we're trying to give our children the best possible chance in life. And this may include genome editing in the future, but in a sense in which we may then choose a certain kind of people. So I'm not answering your question, Thomas, of what I think we should do, but I would definitely things that I haven't discussed it because at the point, we are not at the point in which it is a feasible scenario to enhance our children or to choose them, but it is definitely an area in which there is no consensus at all. So,
Quick work by the others.
Well, I kind of think the reality is, as we all know, there's biohackers out there who are trying their best to kind of circumvent the whole clinical trial aspect. Certainly in my field, in HIV, there are people who are trying to engineer themselves, and there are people who are doing it in sports. So I guess watch this space. It's probably, the future's probably going to come faster than we realize.
Absolutely, and I think I myself included, get often caught up in the argument that in most cases enhancement just isn't going to be possible for many applications and things like that. I'm never going to be able to edit my embryos to be able to, create a child that's more musically talented. And so I get sort of all caught up in that, but if we do that, then I guess we stop ourselves from thinking about when things are more possible, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so yeah, I think it's a really important point to still be considering as we move forward.
Okay, I'd like to thank the panel speakers and the audience for sticking around for the questions. Thank you so much.